Finally, let's talk about sync on the Endorphin.es Furthrrrr Generator. Both oscillators allow both hard and soft sync. Both oscillators feature jacks, so you can sync them to external oscillators. It's rare that you see both soft sync and hard sync jacks on the same oscillator. I'll be honest, I haven't explored that yet, but that should lead to some madness. And also, the carrier oscillator can lock or sync to the modulation or mood oscillator. That has a couple of uses. One's the typical sync sound, and the other is to maybe help out with some of your FM patching. I'm already looking at the square wave from the modulation oscillator because its edges are what's going to give a sync signal over to the carrier oscillator. I'm going to look at the sawtooth out of the carrier because you can really see what happens to that waveform during sync. And speaking of which, you can see that this waveform has an interesting glitch in its zero crossing transition. Again, in its standard configuration, the Endorphin.es Furthrrrr Generator is a triangle core oscillator. Internally, it builds a triangle, even though that's not presented as one of the output options. The sawtooth is derived from that by saying, hey, when we get to a peak, invert the triangle so that it keeps falling to create the rest of the falling sawtooth ramp. Well, you don't always get that calibration exactly right, and that glitch is a little bit of a calibration issue of converting a triangle to a saw. The result is just a buzzier waveform. You see the harmonic spectra has a slight bump up at the right edge there. Let's go play a lower note, so maybe you can see even more of the harmonic spectra. It's a little brighter than your typical saw, but not too far off. Otherwise, it has a pretty full set of harmonics. Put this into drone mode again, so you can hear what's going on. And I'm actually going to go ahead and put the carrier oscillator an octave higher than the modulation oscillator, because sync is much more obvious when the carrier is trying to fit multiple cycles into one cycle of the modulation. Just go up an octave. As a fifth. Pretty close to an octave there. So there's just the carrier. We're going to look at hard sync first. And that basically says reset the sawtooth at an edge of the master oscillator, the square wave in this case, because we're converting an internal triangle wave to a sawtooth that happens to be the middle of the falling ramp. As I start to change the tuning of the carrier, the sawtooth, you'll see where we're constantly resetting there, that rising edge of the square, regardless of where the sawtooth is in its cycle at that point. So the tuning is always based on the modulator, which is the master. But we're getting an additional set of harmonics based on how the carrier is tuned in relation to the modulator. I can sit here and turn this dial all day, which is kind of fun. Create alternate waveforms. But the typical sync sound is to take an envelope output, here's an output from my envelope generator, and use it to bend the frequency of the slaved oscillator. So I'll plug into the exponential input, start triggering some notes, and start increasing the modulation depth, the pitch bend in reaction to this envelope. Go for a lower note. A little bit of filtering. And that's your typical sync sound. Back to drone, turn off the cutoff, go back to my middle C. Now soft sync follows a different set of rules compared to hard sync. Instead of saying always reset when that square wave is resetting, it says, well, if you're close to resetting, then go ahead and reset. So let's switch over to soft sync. You see it's already a little bit glitchier. And it's going to reset on its own schedule sometimes. He's trying to decide whether or not to bother to sync because it's already close to its own reset. So there's a different set of sounds. Go back down here. And start triggering notes. This is actually a pretty well-behaved version of soft sync. A lot of soft syncs aren't very usable for tonal applications, although they're really cool sound effects. But I could use this in a patch. Bring in some of the Moog's oscillator. Open up my filter again. Now the one final thing that the sync is kind of useful for inside the Furthrrrr generator is if you're having trouble getting the two oscillators to lock together while doing some FM applications. You can see where they're already drifting from each other right now. I'm going to go back to the sine wave, or in this case, why not just the final output with the wave folders turned down. Sine wave again. And let's say I'm modulating the carrier with my mood oscillator. I'm going to modulate with the sine wave, but I'm going to continue to look at the square wave just to see where my reset point is, that rising edge of the square wave. I'm going to go ahead and turn on frequency modulation, drone by turning on the VCA, increase my mood index. A little bit of entrainment between the oscillators there, so it's not too bad for the tuning. Sometimes you get this beating, particularly at different pitches. Maybe you want a steady tone. Well, in that case, you might want to lock the carrier oscillator to the modulation oscillator. Now, you're not going to get that drifting, beating tone. And you can still go ahead and play around with modulation depth, and even envelope that modulation depth to create our typical FM sound. Now, you don't have quite as much freedom in tuning the carrier oscillator in relation to the modulation oscillator because it's always going to get reset. So you can't create interesting intervals like fourths and fifths. You get stuff like this. Basically, you get a sync sound because you're resetting. But still some interesting, almost vowel-like sounds there. Maybe a little bit of slow modulation here. So it is actually an alternate path when you're programming FM, is consider mixing sync into the equation just to give you another set of waveforms and timbres to play with without worrying about tracking and keeping things in tune as you play across the keyboard. Just another case of how flexible the Furthrrrr generator is.